Welcome to Plot Diagnostics, where we provide treatments for grievously injured plot lines. Remember before how I've mentioned incomplete concepts in Ace Combat 7? Well, there's no greater example of this than the IUN, and by extension its peacekeeping forces. When I made my introduction video for this series, I said that Ace Combat 7 has so many problems that it's difficult to narrow down what to talk about. But with the IUN, it's the exact opposite problem. And that's kind of a massive issue when it's literally the first faction you're introduced to and fight for. Or, at least I think you fight for them? Put a pin in that. As far as I can tell, the IUN's primary role in Ace Combat 7 amounts to essentially communicating between branches of the Osean military, something it struggles to do, and finding Trigger guilty of killing Harling. After said events, the IUN outside of the Mission 5 briefing isn't mentioned again until the debriefing for Farbanti. And you'd be forgiven for not remembering that because it's so abrupt given that the IUN's name hasn't been uttered for more than half the game up to that point. You probably won't catch it on your first playthrough. All they say is you're at a peacekeeping force forward base. There's literally 11 missions in between the second to last mention of the IUN in the story and the final one after mission 15. That means the IUN, which is the entire reason Trigger is court-martialed in the first place, is the initial faction that's attacked, and is the primary armed force involved in the first 4 missions of the game, again I think, plus the 3-mission prologue in VR. Despite all those qualifiers and clear indicators of substantial importance, is absent for 15 of the 20 missions, or 18 of the 23 including DLC. And if we're being realistic, 16 or 19 of them, since I would hardly call the easy-to-miss reference in the debriefing of Farbanti an actual appearance. Even the penal unit gets passing mentions in gameplay and remains relevant in the side story. It's also incredibly vague on if Trigger and his allies in the first 4 missions are actually IUN peacekeepers, or if they're simply under command of the IUN on the basis of Osea not having an active military presence in Usea yet. Maybe similar to how America does things in real life. Yes, you heard that right. It's unclear which faction the protagonist, the character you play as, is even a part of. And you might say it's obviously the IUN given the first briefing, but we're shown in the VR mode that IUN peacekeeping forces wear the markings of the IUN, not their home country, which not a single aircraft in the campaign does. Perhaps it's an oversight, and it probably is. But it leads to the very real problem of not being able to understand what the IUN even is as a faction. Strange Real as a world has been absent an international body since the Assembly of Nations was mentioned in Ace Combat 0. But third-party sources and advertisements for the games in the 2000s indicate there is a United Nations equivalent in Strange Real, so you'd think this is that, right? But if that's the case, then this is some Kevin Spacey declaring war on the UN shit from Advanced Warfare. Erusea doesn't just attack Osea, they attack specifically peacekeeping forces.
So let's be clear. I am here to solve the world's problems. And I believe the world's problems begin with you.
Also, I should say here, I'm generally not taking third-party sources into account. The audience should not have to consult third parties to understand a story. Although, even in this case, they don't really help, and they actually just make things much worse. But disregarding that, the actual problem here is that there's literally nothing to build from when it comes to how you'd even handle a rewrite of this faction's role in the story. It's not elaborated on how the IUN functions as an international body, who their members are, who supports them, how they're equipped, and who provides soldiers. We get an answer to some of these questions in Aces at War, but those answers are utter nonsense, and contrary to the characterization of certain people, mainly Harling. It completely misunderstands the concept of an international body with foreign soldiers. For God's sake, the IUN actually owns land and factories in Aces at War. And apparently they've been around since the 90s and were involved in the Free Erusian Uprising in 2006. And also, half the faction's peacekeeping units are comprised of Oseans? You know how many UN peacekeepers in real life are American? 20. Yeah, this is why we don't take third-party sources into account. So, where do we even begin to fix this mess? As I've said before, any change to certain elements of 7 is liable to completely alter the story in some capacity, and unfortunately, I don't really see an alternative here. Beyond just removing the IUN as a faction, which is probably the most reasonable proposal, there's gotta be at least one way to make this work. And I do have an idea for that, but we already run into a problem. Because 7 calls the treaty that ended the Continental War the IUN ceasefire agreement, which, guys, it wasn't an agreement. Erusia lost. Like, unconditionally. You would never come out of Ace Combat 4 thinking Erusia had any room to negotiate. Yet, despite this, at least according to what we see in Ace Combat 7, Erusia didn't lose any territory. But wait, hold on! Aces at War said they lost Gunther Bay! But where's that in the game? Alright, so we have a chicken-egg problem here, because if we want to go with the idea that Erusia lost Gunther Bay, which is now an IUN trust territory, then the only way in which I could see that resulting in war is if the space elevator wasn't there. Why? Well, because the space elevator would really only benefit Erusia by being where it is, even if not directly under their control. Especially if it's IUN, aka internationally controlled. But Ruby, the IUN are puppets of Osea! Shut the fuck up. Just stop talking. We don't even know how the IUN functions. But Ace Combat 7 and Aces at War want two different things. For it to be an Osean puppet, and for it to be an international body. And you're going to tell me that there are no other nations that have competing interests with Osea at this point in the Security Council? Oh, that's right. We don't know if this faction has a Security Council. We don't even see any non-Oseans fighting on the side of Osea in the entirety of 7. Like, what? How did Assault Horizon handle this better? Oh, right, because Jim DeFelice is actually a good writer. But Mr. Kono over here decided we should instead copy Call of Duty, and then the Ace Combat fandom decided to collectively attack this dude for something that was completely out of his control, instead of this dude, and especially this dude, who have been plagues on this franchise since Ace Combat 5. Top-notch display, fellas. Love y'all. Alright, we're just throwing all that out. I'm sorry, but this is just such a nightmare to work out as is. I'm tossing it. Here's what they should have done. You want to accompany a UN faction? Fine. How about after the war in Ace Combat 4, Erusia loses territory? And let's actually establish that fact in the game, shall we? 7 was an opportunity to do that, so let's do it. It is because of 7, after all, that we know there were nations that existed that Erusia absorbed. So it'd be awfully weird for the ISAF to not broker an agreement that liberates these nations. It would be in their best interest, after all. According to Aces at War, Gunther Bay is an IUN trust territory, so we'll run with that idea. Following the events of Ace Combat 4, the peace deal that's drafted liberates several nations that haven't existed for many years, such as Voslage and Shalaji, for example. These nations are handed over to the IUN to maintain stability and guide them towards self-governance. But Free Erusia remains an ever-present threat, and so peacekeeping forces are stationed in these new territories to act as a barrier, kind of like VR mode might have been trying to insinuate. Wait, what did VR mode say?
That's why I put in a request to have you assigned to the newly established IUN PKF.
So, apparently, the IUN, which had been carrying out peacekeeping operations since the 90s, didn't have a peacekeeping force until at or around 2014. That's an interesting tidbit. Okay, moving on. So, for my suggestion, unfortunately this is going to have to change a lot, but it's the only way to make the faction work in 7. Let's say the Free Erusian Uprising is the basis for the conflict in 7. Instead of Erusia just attacking the IUN and Osea for dubious reasons, which doesn't make sense anyway given the IUN is an international body, or at least should be, and it would be political suicide to directly attack them, Free Erusia is the one to attack IUN bases in the IUN trust territories, and is able to do so with the backing of, but not the explicit military support in this instance, of Erusia. This damages the IUN peacekeeping forces significantly, and causes them to withdraw from said territories. You can still have your cake and eat it too, with Free Erusia commencing guerrilla attacks all over the continent, kind of like what VR was going for. And while all this is happening, following the IUN's temporary withdrawal, Erusia moves itself into and occupies the territories the IUN was forced to abandon. Think of it in a similar manner to the Vietnam War, where the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong are two separate entities working together for essentially the same goal. Although given the initial catalyst for the conflict, you could have not just Osea intervene, but the IUN form a coalition to combat Erusia's hostile takeover. Maybe, like the first few missions of 7 indicate, some Usean nations would be sympathetic to Erusia, and allow the Free Erusians to operate in their territory. Again, like the Viet Cong. And, you know, actually show us that there are more than just Oseans in the IUN. It would be a fascinating mix of real-life conflicts such as the aforementioned Vietnam War, Korean War, and even modern conflicts if we want to make drones a significant factor like in the actual game. It'd be a proxy war. Did I basically just suggest cutting out the Lighthouse War entirely? Yes. Yes, I did. But that conflict is such nonsense that it deserves its own video, and I'm really not confident the IUN can fit into that narrative. But wait, Ruby, you might be saying. What about the IUN's involvement in previous games?
Oh, Mike, don't say that, because that irritates me, and I punch blokes in the mouth for saying that. Don't you dare say that.
Frankly, I don't know if that can be remedied, because no previous game left that door open. At best, maybe some of Ace Combat 6 could be retconned to include the IUN, but I just don't know if that works. It's a concept that's been introduced way too late into the series to be implemented organically, and that's outside of the fact it was handled poorly in the game it was actually first implemented in. As an alternative suggestion for future games, the best I could do is say the IUN is just a mercenary faction created by Osea post-2010, but that doesn't really make sense given the way they're presented in the 4 missions we do get to see them. It seems like very little thought was put into their origins, their functionality, and their exit from the war, and ultimately, if that's the effort that was put in, it follows that it takes a ton of effort to get them to a presentable state in Strange Real, because there's almost nothing there to begin with. Thank you for watching Plot Diagnostics. Stay tuned for more treatments of grievously injured plotlines.